Okay, this chapter is pretty simple and straightforward. We're going to take a look at really a couple of different geographical areas. We're going to take a look at what's going on in China, then what goes on in Japan, and then how developments in East Asia really tend to affect the bigger world. The first part of the chapter you're going to be reading about essentially deals with this Ming China. The really the This first period from 1368 until 1644 is a transition period in Chinese history. It's when the Mongols are eventually booted out and the a pure Chinese dynasty returns with the beginnings of the Ming dynasty. So you'll read about Emperor Tezu, you'll read about the administration of the Ming dynasty. Make sure you understand how the Red Turban Rebellion happens and how the Mongols are eventually put down and the Ming dynasty begins. So you'll read about this part of really the Chinese administration, the really the beginnings of really to be honest, it's a pretty brutal time in Chinese history. The Ming Dynasty, of course, makes Beijing one of the most important places. The Forbidden City is there. Of course, this becomes one of the most important places in China. There you can see the bigger picture of the Forbidden City. The You'll get to see a little bit about the problems Ming China faced. You'll also get to see really the emphasis on the the repairing and the rebuilding of parts of the Great Wall to try to make sure that the rest of the Mongols stay out. The So you'll see the kind of the emphasis up here on the Great Wall. But you'll also talk a little bit about civil service exams. One of the highlights of Ming China is the return to civil service examinations. We have civil service examinations today, but nothing like the Ming did, where it is based entirely on your understanding of Confucian thought, Confucian philosophy. That schools were established to try to teach, especially for wealthy families, to try to teach children at an early age about Confucian philosophy. But civil service exams were open to anyone, and this was your ticket into government service, which could be very wealthy. It gave your family a tremendous amount of prestige. Even though the Ming Dynasty tended to treat those people very badly, it was still a kind of a ticket to stardom in a lot of ways. So, Ming scholars, Ming court officials, Ming administrators were all also Confucian scholars. The exams were tough. It was a full day exam. It took sometimes almost a month to grade. And if you'd done well, then you were given another exam to see if you could improve your status. So, understanding Confucian philosophy was a big deal in Ming China. You'll also talk a little bit about Ming products, everything from manufacturing, from agriculture, textiles, paper, silk, porcelain. Ming porcelain is highly desirable even today. The printing, publications, novels, food, drink, all of that stuff is very important. You'll read about that. Some examples, by the way, there is some Ming porcelain, and it is beautiful. It is stunning, and it's very highly sought after today. And also a little bit of architecture here. You can see the Temple of Heaven, for example, built by the Ming Emperor Yongle. This is where the emperor made his appeal to heaven for good harvests and things like that. And a little bit of China, a little bit of Chinese art here. So you can see it's a very artistic period. It's a period of time where really China restores itself after being dominated by the Mongols. Decline happens though. It's the dynastic cycle all over again. If you took the first part of this class, you usually talked about the mandate of heaven, and the end really of dynasties comes when you have poor leadership, economic problems, military problems, political problems, natural disasters. You get all these that will eventually end Ming China in 1644 and will be replaced by what a lot of textbooks used to call the old Manchu dynasty. That technical name for it is Qing. All right, anytime you see a Q in China is usually pronounced with a CH. So the Manchu dynasty or the Qing dynasty that begins after 1644 and lasts until, well, technically until we get into the 1900s. It is in the beginning a very competent dynasty. You'll talk about Kangxi, for example. You'll read about the some of the great Ming leaders, some of whom ruled very long. All right, and that's one of the things that helps the early Qing dynasty become fairly stable. It's also a time period where you'll see China expand a little bit into Tibet and Nepal and some of these other areas as well. And they will also begin to push this way north into Russian territory as well. And that will they'll eventually sort of set the border between Manchuria and Russia. So that takes a look at what's going on in China during this period. So you can read about that stuff for yourself. All right. And it's a pretty simple, pretty straightforward sort of period of time. Then you move to Japan. All right. So you leave China behind for a little while and move to Japan. It's called Japan's Middle Ages, and it's very similar in a lot of ways to medieval Europe. Some of the things that go on in China are very similar to what we saw in Europe during the Middle Ages. Building of castles, all right, warfare, noble lords, landowning lords, right, and knights, which become the samurai. So it's a very, in a lot of ways, similar period of time. You begin really with the shogunate period, and you'll read about that, which unfortunately really devolves into a civil war. Civil war between the shoguns breaks out in Kyoto and in other places, and that will spread into the countryside. Warlords, daimyo, they will begin to try to protect what they have by building castles surrounding them, just like we saw in Middle Ages Europe with moats and walls to try to protect what they owned. The Civil War leads to these guys, Nobunaga and Hideyoshi. The Oda Nobunaga is the first real powerful daimyo, and he will recruit his followers from samurai. Japan begins to grow, but he is eventually forced to commit suicide when he is replaced by Hideyoshi. He will succeed in power. He offers many of the other daimyo land. Really, the angry daimyo who are unhappy about Hideyoshi coming to power, his response is essentially to make them feudal lords. Look, if you'll follow me, I will give you land, I'll give you a military position, you swear allegiance to me. And that's very similar to the feudal system that you may have heard about that goes on in Middle Ages Europe. And essentially, you have the same thing peasants who are going to do the agricultural labor. They are farmers. Peasants become farmers. They can't carry weapons. The samurai become the knights. They are allowed and they become the fighting class. And the daimyo essentially become the feudal lords. The Hideyoshi will eventually, and we'll talk about this in a minute, where really Hideyoshi really falters because he will attempt to conquer China. And along the way, he tries to conquer Korea. The Chinese get mad. They help Koreans out. And this essentially sort of bankrupts the rule of Hideyoshi. But he will be out. He will be replaced by Tokugawa. And Tokugawa Ieyasu, who we'll talk about in a second. Now, remember me telling you about castles? There you go. Okay, this is a Japanese castle, and this is one built by Hideyoshi. It is massive, and it's very similar to what we saw. Here's another one that you can see, wall moat, all right, very inaccessible. Tokugawa shogunate really begins in what's called the Edo period. Edo is early Tokyo. It's really what becomes Tokyo. And Tokugawa is really a a guy that is some ways absolute. He reminds me in some of the things that he does of what Louis XIV did to become absolute. He consolidated relations. Then he forced the other lords essentially to live with him in Edo for a specific time period. And then when they weren't there, he kept their families there as essentially hostages. Louis XIV did the same thing to the nobles. He invited them to come and live in Versailles and kept them there and made them stay there. So he could really keep an eye on them. So this is also the time period where essentially Japan sort of gets cut off from the rest of the world as well. Concerns about Christian influences, the arrival of the Jesuits and others will lead to Japan being cut off. This is really when Japan begins to make its way out of its own Middle Ages. Trade increases, merchant families grow up, cities begin to develop, and it's a very similar thing to what happens in Europe. You'll go on to read a little bit about Japanese culture as well during this period of time. The entertainment for men, tea houses, the geishas, and things like that you'll read about as well. And then the chapter goes on to talk a little bit about the really the beginning of a much bigger sort of way of thinking about relations between the world and the Far East. You'll read about the voyages of Jing He, the his voyages of exploration during the Ming Dynasty. So 317 ships, some of them huge, who will go to all places around China looking really to see what else is out there. They go to Vietnam, to Indonesia, to India, and as far away as East Africa. So you'll see really those voyages of exploration. Japanese pirates were also important. Hideyoshi tries to get rid of them, and the Japanese islands were loaded with pirates. And really, Hideyoshi is he's so impressed with how good these guys are that this is why he invades Korea unsuccessfully. The chapter really ends though with there you can kind of see the arrival of the Europeans and what the European arrival will do to these areas. Portuguese, the Dutch, both will establish relations with these areas. You'll also begin to have the influence of Christian missionaries, especially the Jesuits, who will come into these areas. Francis Xavier, Matteo Ricci, you'll read about them during the chapter as well, and how many of them believe that Confucianism and its value system was very compatible with Christianity. So that's always not going to go very well. I told you the Japanese are going to eventually sort of try to push out the uh, the arrival of Christianity into those areas. So you'll see examples of the Jesuit presence in China. Now there is an exchange that takes place, and everybody from Voltaire to even here in the United States, you'll see some sort of positive views about China. Chinese medical practices are shared as well, such as the inoculation for smallpox idea. So the Dutch will arrive as well. And eventually, right at the end of the chapter, you'll read about the British beginning to come on the scene as well. So the bigger part of this chapter is to make sure that you understand what's going on in China with the really the end of the Ming Dynasty, the beginning of the Qing Dynasty, what's going on in Japan. This is essentially Japan's Middle Ages, and how the Europeans have begun to arrive in this area. And if you'll do that, you'll get a pretty good picture of what East Asia was like as we sort of get into this period.